I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before coming to our argument, we want to talk first about what's opening debate has been talking this debate. Firstly, coming to the opening government. Opening government has explained many things about how bad is beauty standard, why beauty standard creating insecurities for women, how it creates many problems for people in general. We understand that problem the opening government explained good enough. But the problem with opening government is that they never explain why we must attack or aggressively oppose the K-pop industry in particular. Never explain why K-pop industry is the main perpetrators or the biggest problem that is happening to beauty standards right now. In this kind of situation, the OG has failed to answer the question given by the opening opposition in this debate, saying that why only K-pop while others beauty standards also exist in this kind of situation, in this kind of situation the only alternative is that we will get other social movement to actually support our movement because we are have the common interest in the end of the day. But they never explain why then just suddenly LGBT and Black Lives Movement, for example, will just pivot their way to support this kind of feminist movement against K-pop when they have their own problem. Now coming to the opening opposition, right? They already questioned the opening government in this kind of situation, saying that there's many beauty standards, and we should support other beauty standards to create diversity in this kind of situation, so that women can actually choose what kind of standard that they wanted or what kind of beauty that they accepted in this kind of situation. But the problem is they never accept the magnitude of outreach the K-pop industry has in this kind of situation. Their only solution or their only answer to this kind of situation is only saying that, oh, this is just an industry, they are just trying to fulfill demands, and it is okay to actually do this because it is actually part of self-actualization for these women to inside this kind of K-pop industry to actually to portray their beauty and to portray their uniqueness in this kind of situation. Like the CG is going to answer this question: why K-pop in particular, and why K-pop is, and why this kind of situation other beauty standard is actually being destroyed by K-pop. Firstly, about talking about this kind of why K-pop is because K-pop has the biggest outreach comparatively to other beauty standard or other exposure to this kind of situation where women actually know what kind of beauty standard that they wanted in this kind of situation. The problem is K-pop has this kind of big exposure, has big platform that other beauty standard is not getting the same traction as they should have been in this kind of situation. If the opening opposition were to support diversity, then they should support in our proposal, because in our proposal we want to support more diversity in the same platform where everybody can see other beauty standard and they can accept those beauty standards. Comparatively, in OO, they wanted to just continue with K-pop being the dominant forces, getting the most exposure, meaning other beauty standards will not get the same traction, meaning that their goals of creating this kind of diversity is not gonna get created in the end of the day. We answered the OG's faults and never explaining why K-pop in particular, because we understand K-pop outreach is the biggest. They work with the biggest platform, biggest companies. They have the biggest concert, biggest following. We understand that their outreach is very big in this kind of situation. Therefore, we want to attack K-pop first or oppose K-pop first because of those particular things. Now, coming to our argument, we have three particular arguments. Firstly, about the beauty standard. Even if you don't take our argument about saying that, oh, the K-pop is the biggest in this kind of situation and their beauty standard is harmful. Even if you don't accept that, we have other alternative. Their beauty standard is being utilized as a power in order to get more money to the industry in the end of the day, as explained by open opposition, saying that, oh, this industry is just fulfilling demands, meaning it's just for the benefit of this kind of particular industry in the end of the day. The problem is this particular beauty standard is not utilized to empower women. They are utilized in order for this industry to get more money, and they never be paid back to the society, that to the communities of these women inside the K-pop industry, actually never giving them the same treatment that they should have been given comparatively to their contribution to the K-pop industry as a whole. And we will explain that later on in my second argument. This is why we believe the beauty standard, even if it is okay and part of this kind of diversity given by the opening opposition, we don't take that as a benefit, because we understand that this beauty standard created by the K-pop industry is not on the basis that we will empower women in the end of the day, but only for the benefit of the company in the end of the day. Now, coming to our second argument about why and how workers are treated in K-pop industry. This is where CG is different between CG and OG. CG doesn't want to talk only about beauty standard, but CG wants to talk about how women are treated inside the industry. In the end of the day, we understand inside the industry, the idols have been given contracts since they are only children, and then they have to follow hard and exhausting training, and their private life is very controlled. They cannot start family, they cannot start a love life in this kind of situation. They are very, very controlled by the industry in the end of the day. The second thing is that they have to follow unreasonable schedule and also diet in order to maintain their physique, or if they don't want to follow that, then they cannot continue being the main idols of the particular management in the end of the day. And there's no way for them right now to get out from that contract, because they already put in contracts in their childhood where they don't have this kind of situation consent in order to continue, but they have to fulfill the contract until they are old in this kind of situation. The second thing is that many parents now feel that idols is the way for their children to become people who actually get income that could fulfill their life in the end of the day. Many parents now pushing their children in order to become idols, getting them to private classes to either to dance, singing, or acting in this kind of situation, pushing them to get into something that they don't want in the first place. This is how the industry treats its most important assets in this kind of situation. We understand that they doesn't treat women with the same respect as contrasting to their contribution to the whole industry in the end of the day. This is why we as a feminist movement cannot leave these people inside the industry behind. Some even face serious mental health issues, suicidal thoughts, and even suicidal attempts in this kind of situation. We believe this must be stopped. This is why we believe feminist movement must step in and oppose this kind of industry in order to treat their women better in this kind of situation. That's why we believe this treatment of women should be the basis on why we oppose this kind of industry in the end of the day. Now, coming to the third argument, is about advocacy. Right now, there's no advocacy for those working inside this kind of K-pop industry in the end of the day. They don't have way to get out. They don't have people to advocate. And this is why the feminists must step in, because we understand feminist is the only advocacy movement that will advocate for these women inside the K-pop industry. And this is why we believe we have to push the industry to create to create better treatment to their workers, to create better contract for their workers, and actually create a situation where their life is secure, their family life, their love life, and everything is secure inside their industry. This is where we as closing government believe the feminists should aggressively oppose this industry in the end of the day. Thank you very much.
Okay, I hope I'm audible. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. One point of clarification before proceeding on towards the clashes and why CG wins the debate as a whole, right? For the main clarification is that when we talk about supporting under standards, we don't necessarily like support glorify beauty standards in general. We just say that in order for opening opposition case to work or closing opposition case to work in general, they need to provide the same platform towards other beauty standards. Therefore, all choices will be justified. But considering they don't necessarily talk about that, the argument is a flaw. So here, as the whip, I would like to educate why in the end of the day, CG should be the first, should be the person, should be the bench that win the debate as a whole in the end of the day. What makes CG different with OG is quite simple. First of all, is that we give a massive contribution on how different K-pop necessarily is. But second of all, we break the deadlock in the opening benches, which is about beauty standards in the end of the day. We provide mechanization why in the end of the day, how those type of standards is actually being manifested inside of the society. So the way you should judge the debate is not basic, is not just about principal identity, but also how those manifestation of principal identity would manifest in the end of the day. Because those principles will not necessarily be important if you cannot necessarily expand the harms, and that is the most exclusive contribution coming from CG. But let's kick CO out of the debate, right? I think CO is three things. First, they're irrelevant. Second, they're quite derivative. But number third, they're really lack of engagement. So goodbye to them. So first of all, with OG, why CG is above OG, right? Basically, our arguments when we talk about the rising and the trend and whatsoever, the exploitation and protection, but we also when we talk about the beauties, how the beauty standard is necessarily going to manifest in the end of the day, it is the prerequisite for their harms, for OG's harm to actually manifest in the end of the day, right? Because OG talks about how beauty standards is exactly that harmful towards individuals, for example. But in order for their argumentation to work, is with CG's argumentation and analysis on how this argumentation necessarily works inside of the K-pop industry. Because we have already told you that K-pop is exactly that massive to begin with. Not even all opposition could actually disagree towards that in the end of the day, right? But the main issue is that the manifestation of these beauty standards in itself, it benchmarks others in the end of the day, which is why the prerequisite of argumentation is better than OG in the end of the day. But even if OG have their own analysis, we'll say CG's impact and benefits is far better than OG's in the end of the day, right? Why? Because OG only talks about how beauty standards will necessarily manifest in the end of the day. The beauty standards harms in the end of the day on an individual level, for example. We don't try to take into account then about the K-pop standards, which what opening opposition necessarily said. CG doesn't necessarily, CG talks about how is it harmful for the individuals in itself, but also for the K-pop industry to begin with. This is where my arguments is actually that important because it is just for massive and more actors are actually involved. So let's talk about opening opposition. Opening opposition talks about two things, right? Which is choices and supply and demand and whatnot. But the reason why CG wins opening opposition are like this. First of all, it's on the idea of choices. At best, it is a deadlock. Why? Because two massive reasons, right? Number one, their characterization of standards, which is different. I think it's based on physical standards in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. But the way you should create a parameter of standards to begin with is to create a parameter of impacts in the end of the day. Based on that logic in itself, the standards is the same in the end of the day. It will still stay the same in the end of the day anyway. But moreover, this argumentation doesn't necessarily make sense in the end of the day because opening opposition should also talks about if they actually celebrate with the standards that massive in the end of the day, how the current situation of feminist movement followers is actually going to react. For example, considering we have been fighting physical standards throughout our entire campaign in the end of the day. Heck, that is basically what modern feminism necessarily going to look like, right? But second reason is about the other alternatives and support in the end of the day. So there are three layers why this thing is necessarily bad with opening opposition, right? Because opening opposition talks about if others can get the same, there are other alternatives that we want to bring, we want to have choices and so on and so forth. But the main issue, this is where my members' argument is important, right? Because the mechanization of dominant narrative inside of the K-pop industry is that massive. Is benchmark all standards in the end of the day. Even the deputy leader of opposition agrees to this by saying that African can exactly adapt towards K-pop industry to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. But it is exactly what our arguments necessarily stands for. I think it's also a massive question hole coming from opening opposition. Second reason is the self-actualization won't necessarily exist, right? Opening opposition is running away from the burden. What if the additional standards is exactly that bad in the end of the day? It only talks about if it is going to be necessarily that good in the end of the day. But comparatively, CG talks about how the burden in itself, how additional standards in itself is exactly that harmful to begin with, right? It talks about how the additional standards is going to create more harms towards the individuals, for example, and how it will harm the K-pop industry as general. So it is not worth of celebration in the end of the day. The choices argument is hard to buy out. At best, it is a deadlock. But the way CG break the deadlock is tell you guys how the harm is going to be necessarily manifest, right? Because we create real dangers towards the people who experience this issue personally, ladies and gentlemen, which is the burden coming from OG that OO doesn't want to talk about. But CG amplifies this burden by saying that the harm doesn't necessarily exist outside of K-pop in itself, but also within the K-pop in itself, because the way K-pop industry works, they exploit this type of beauty stars to get right. They put women, for example, as the main attention correlation and the way to gain money, for example. But third of all, it's on the idea of supply and demand. Why CG just win the debate in the idea of impacts, right? I think it doesn't make sense the way they frame this argument. Because if supply and demand is something which is completely justified, then I think they should also defend why communism propaganda is something which is completely okay if the world wants to demand it in the end of the day. It just shows you that just because people want it doesn't necessarily it has great impacts towards society to begin with. It's just fulfilling the conservatism values in the end of the day, which is what my member have already told you in the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. But second of all, it's not necessarily that important, right? Because the impacts will yeah, it's basically like that, right? So in the end of the day, my member provides far better arguments of protection and harms in the end of the day, right? We talk about two things. Number one, on the idea of protection towards the people of the society in general, because we say that people in general should not experience this level of threat if issue in the end of the day. That's why you should aggressively call them out because they are the dominant narrative right now. Every single standard is being benchmarked in the end of the day. But second of all, we create better K-pop industry, for example, because we create advocacy platform. That's what my members have told you. Proud to propose.